The ballroom was immaculate, illuminated by chandeliers that cast a golden glow over the tables adorned with crystal glasses and perfectly arranged floral centerpieces. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, and the atmosphere exuded sophistication, exactly the kind of party Mark loved. An event designed to reaffirm his status as a successful man, surrounded by a loving family. But in the midst of that carefully curated perfection, Emma felt like a misplaced piece. The moment she stepped inside, she noticed the subtle glances and overly polite smiles. Some people recognized her, but hesitated before approaching, as if unsure how they were supposed to treat her. And when she finally reached the reception table, she saw what her stepmother had prepared for her. A white name tag with gold lettering, identical to the others, except for one brutal difference: Emma, the family's burden. She held the name tag for a moment, the weight of the words sinking into her skin like a old wound being reopened. A cruel joke, and worse, a clear message. The worst part wasn't the explicit humiliation, but the silent complicity. No surprise on Sarah's or Jake's faces. No outrage from Mark. To them, this was merely a reminder of what had always been evident. Emma did not belong there. But what they didn't know was that the Emma, who stayed silent, who quietly accepted both the small and the great cruelties, had disappeared years ago. She hadn't come here to be welcomed. She had come to close this chapter for good. Emma placed the name tag back on the table, her fingers steady, her expression unreadable. A younger version of herself might have flinched, might have looked around hoping, begging for someone to say it was just a mistake. But not this time. She had learned long ago that hoping for decency from these people was like expecting warmth from a winter storm. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the room, scanning the sea of familiar faces, each one part of the carefully curated illusion that her father had built. Old friends of the family, business partners, distant relatives, none of whom had reached out in years. They all knew who she was, and yet, here she stood, an outsider in the home she had once desperately tried to belong to. She stepped forward, moving past the whispers and stolen glances, her heels clicking against the polished floor with quiet confidence. Linda was the first to notice her arrival, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around the stem of a champagne glass as her lips curled into a smug smile. Sarah and Jake, standing beside their mother, exchanged a quick glance but said nothing. And then, as if sensing a shift in the air, Mark turned. For a split second, there was something almost resembling recognition in his eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. He didn't rush to greet her. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked mildly inconvenienced, as if she were a business meeting he had forgotten to cancel. That was all the confirmation she needed. Emma exhaled slowly, steadying herself. This was not the moment to let emotions take over. She had spent too many years battling the weight of being unwanted, of feeling like an intruder in her own family. Tonight, she would not play their game. She walked toward the bar, ignoring the forced smiles and half-hearted nods, her presence a silent disruption in the carefully controlled environment. The bartender barely glanced at her as he poured a drink, too absorbed in the steady flow of guests, with real connections to the man being celebrated. She let the glass sit untouched on the counter. She wasn't here to drink. She was here to remind them all of something they had long forgotten she existed, and she wasn't ashamed of it. From the corner of her eye, she saw Linda lean into Mark, whispering something with a smirk that sent a ripple of laughter through their small circle. The same laughter that had once echoed through the halls of her childhood home, as she sat alone in her room, listening to their new family bond over shared jokes and inside stories that never included her. A part of her had wanted to believe, for years, that Mark was just oblivious, that maybe he didn't realize how they treated her, how Linda made sure she remained an outsider. But his silence had always been his answer. He had let it happen. No, worse, he had chosen it, and tonight, he would have to face the consequences of that choice. She turned away from the bar and made her way toward the center of the room, where guests had gathered around Mark, showering him with compliments and well wishes. It was almost laughable how easily they celebrated a man who had discarded his own daughter like an afterthought. As she approached, a few people noticed her presence, some with mild curiosity, others with barely concealed discomfort. It was as if they sensed that she did not belong, that she was an anomaly in this perfect picture. Mark, too, finally acknowledged her, his expression shifting into something carefully neutral. He wasn't happy to see her. He wasn't even irritated. He simply looked indifferent. That indifference stung more than any insult could. But Emma had prepared for this. She refused to let it shake her. Instead, she offered a small, measured smile. "Happy birthday, Dad," she said, her voice steady, deliberately void of warmth. The room quieted, if only slightly. Mark blinked, clearly caught off guard by her directness. He glanced at Linda, who watched with the satisfaction of someone witnessing a spectacle she had orchestrated. "Emma," he said finally, the syllables dragging out as if her name was a foreign concept to him. "I wasn't expecting you." Emma let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah," she said, tilting her head slightly, "I figured." She could feel the tension crackling in the air, the discomfort of the guests who had come to celebrate a man they thought they knew. Mark shifted, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, a habit she recognized from years of watching him prepare for meetings, always needing control, always needing to present himself as composed. But tonight, she was the one who held the control, and for the first time, he seemed to sense it. Linda stepped forward then, ever the perfect hostess, placing a hand on Mark's arm, as if to steady him. "Emma dear," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It's been so long. We weren't sure you'd come." The way she said it, with that well-rehearsed pity, made Emma's stomach twist. She had seen this act before. Linda, the gracious stepmother, the woman who had tried to include her, but simply couldn't force a bond that wasn't there. A lie so neatly packaged, that no one had ever bothered to question it. But tonight, Emma wasn't interested in playing along. Emma met Linda's gaze, holding it just long enough to make the woman shift slightly in her heels. "You weren't sure I'd come," she repeated, her voice calm, but edged with something sharp. "That's interesting, considering you went out of your way to make me feel so welcome." She gestured subtly toward the name tags, and for the first time that evening, Linda faltered. It was brief, barely a flicker of hesitation, but Emma caught it. The room was quiet now, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on the elegant gathering. People were listening. Mark cleared his throat, stepping in like the well-trained businessman he was. "Emma, I don't know what you're talking about." His voice was measured, controlled. "If there's been some misunderstanding." But Emma cut him off with a small shake of her head. "No, Dad, no misunderstanding." She glanced at Sarah and Jake, who stood stiffly at their mother's side, avoiding her gaze. "It's just fascinating how, after all these years, you still think I wouldn't notice." She let the words sink in before continuing. "But I did. I noticed everything." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Mark looked around, as if hoping someone would step in and redirect the moment, but no one did. They were waiting, curious, intrigued, perhaps even entertained, by the unraveling of a family secret, right in the middle of his grand celebration. Emma could see it in their faces. Some feigned discomfort, shifting awkwardly in their spots, while others leaned in slightly, eager for whatever was coming next. For once, she wasn't the one feeling out of place. It was her father. His carefully crafted image beginning to crack in real time. Emma exhaled slowly, steadying herself before delivering the final blow. "You used Mom's college fund," she said, her voice even, but firm. "The money she saved for me. The one thing she left behind to make sure I had a future." A murmur rippled through the guests. "But it wasn't for me, was it?" "No, Jake needed it more." "That's what you said." She looked at her stepbrother then, but he kept his eyes down, pretending to be engrossed. His drink. No defense, no denial, just silence. Mark's face tightened, the carefully controlled mask slipping, just for a second, but it was enough. Emma saw it, the flicker of guilt, quickly swallowed by irritation. He wasn't ashamed of what he had done. He was just annoyed that she was bringing it up here, in front of people who had only ever seen the polished version of him. "Emma," he started, his voice low, an attempt at damage control. "This isn't the time or the place." Emma let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Oh, but it was the time and place when you decided I wasn't part of this family, right?" She gestured around the room, taking in the lavish decorations, the expensive catering, the way everyone here had been welcomed, except for her. "You made that decision a long time ago. You just never thought I'd stop waiting for you to change your mind." She shook her head slightly, a small, resigned smile on her lips. "But I did." A heavy silence settled over the room, thick with discomfort. Mark's guests shifted in place, pretending to be occupied with their drinks, but no one was looking away. They were all witnessing it the moment, The daughter he had so easily discarded, finally stopped pretending. Linda stood frozen, her carefully maintained facade showing the first cracks of unease. Even Sarah and Jake, who had spent years benefiting from Emma's absence, looked uneasy, as if realizing, maybe for the first time, that their comfortable world had been built on someone else's sacrifice. Mark, however, wasn't the type to accept accountability. His shoulders squared, his jaw tightened, and he let out a short, dismissive breath. "Emma, I did what I had to do," he said, as if that justified it all. "You're smart, you've always been resourceful. And look at you now, you figured it out, didn't you?" The words should have stung, but Emma only nodded, absorbing them like confirmation of everything she already knew. "You're right," she said simply. "I did figure it out. I figured out that I never needed you." Mark blinked, thrown off by how easily she said it. Maybe he expected her to lash out, to yell, to crumble under the weight of old wounds. But Emma was past all that. She had spent too many nights mourning the family she never truly had. And now, standing here, watching her father struggle to maintain his pride in front of an audience, she felt something unexpected. Freedom, not the kind that comes with revenge or validation, but the kind that comes way. You finally let go of something that was never meant to be yours. She glanced at the untouched drink in her hand before setting it down on the nearest table. Her decision made. "I just came to see for myself," she said, her voice steady, "to see if maybe I had been wrong all these years, but I wasn't." She gave one last look at the room, the people who had always been so eager to pretend she didn't exist, and then she turned back to Mark, meeting his eyes with a calm certainty. He had never seen in her before. "This is the last time you'll ever see me." For a moment, no one moved. The weight of her words settled over the room, suffocating in its finality. Mark opened his mouth, as if to argue, as if to salvage whatever dignity he had left, but nothing came out. Maybe he had expected her to storm out in tears, to leave in humiliation, so he could spin the story later. Emma, the ungrateful daughter, the troublemaker, the outsider by choice. But that wasn't what happened. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, looking at him like he was a stranger, like he had never been anything more. And that, somehow, was worse than any outburst could have been. Linda's grip tightened on Mark's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve as she gave him a silent warning. "Don't make this worse," but it was already too late. The damage had been done, not by Emma's words, but by years of quiet neglect, by every dismissal, every decision that had told her she was nothing more than a burden. And now, for the first time, it wasn't just her who saw it. Everyone in that room did. Emma didn't wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. She turned on her heel, moving toward the exit, with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through years of loneliness. The difference was, this time, she wasn't leaving in shame, she was leaving on her own terms. She could feel the stares on her back, the whispers starting to ripple through the crowd, but she didn't care. Let them talk. Let them wonder. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to explain herself to anyone. As she reached the door, she paused, just for a second, letting the moment sink in. This was at the end of something that had weighed her down for far too long. Without turning back, she exhaled slowly and stepped outside. The night air was crisp against her skin, carrying with it a sense of finality. It wasn't sadness she felt, it wasn't regret, it was relief. A quiet, undeniable relief that told her she had made the right choice. The city lights stretched out before her, distant and indifferent, yet strangely comforting. Emma inhaled deeply, feeling lighter than she had in years. She had spent so much time believing she needed closure from them, from her father, from the family that never truly saw her. But now she understood closure wasn't something they could give her. It was something she had just given herself. She wasn't walking away from them in defeat. She was walking toward something better, something that had always been waiting for her on the other side of their rejection. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. A message from a friend, asking if she was still coming to the late-night coffee spot they always met at. She smiled, a real, effortless smile. For so long, she had defined herself by the love she never received. But tonight, she realized that real love wasn't something she had to chase. It was something she already had. The people who chose her without hesitation. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to choose herself, too. She walked down the steps. each movement feeling like a quiet rebellion against the years she had spent waiting for acceptance, for an apology, for something that would never come. But she wasn't waiting anymore. The past no longer had its grip on her. She wasn't the unwanted guest at someone else's table. She was the architect of her own life now. And as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the noise of the party fading behind her, she realized she had never truly been part of that world. She had only been haunting it, a ghost of a girl who had once begged to be seen. The air was cold, but she welcomed it. The sharp bite of reality against her skin. It grounded her. No more illusions, no more hoping that maybe, just maybe, things would change. They wouldn't, and that was okay. She had spent too many years carrying the burden of their rejection, but tonight, she left it behind, like an old coat she had outgrown. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear laughter, real, unfiltered, nothing like the rehearsed performances inside that ballroom. It was the sound of life moving forward, and Emma was finally ready to move with it. She pulled out her phone again, her fingers hovering over the screen before she typed a simple reply to her friend, "Be there soon." The words felt small, almost insignificant, but to her, they meant everything. It wasn't just about meeting for coffee. It was about stepping into a life where she wasn't defined by who had failed to love her. No more waiting for an invitation that would never come. No more proving her worth to people who had already decided she wasn't enough. From this moment on, she belonged to herself. As she walked toward the street, she didn't feel anger or sadness anymore. There was no dramatic wave of emotion, no last-minute urge to turn back. Just a quiet, steady certainty that she was finally free. Let them stay in their perfect little world, built on exclusion and silence. She wanted no part of it. And maybe, just maybe, that realization was the real victory. Because they had spent years making her feel like she was the unwanted guest. But in the end, it was them who had lost her. The city buzzed around her, full of strangers going about their lives, each wrapped in their own stories. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she was part of something bigger, something that didn't revolve around the pain of her past. She wasn't the girl left behind anymore. She was just Emma. A person with dreams, with a future that had nothing to do with the people who had tried to make her feel small. The thought sent a warmth through her chest, stronger than any fleeting sadness that threatened to creep in. She crossed the street, moving toward the small cafe where her friend was waiting. The familiar glow of the neon sign felt more like home than her father's house ever had, and as she pushed open the door, she realized something: this was her life now. Not a life spent proving herself to people who never truly saw her, but a life built around the people who did. A life where she was enough, just as she was inside the cafe. The scent of fresh coffee and baked pastries wrapped around her like a welcome she had never received at home. The warmth, the hum of quiet conversations, the casual laughter from a group in the corner. This was the kind of place where she belonged. Not in grand ballrooms, where people measured their worth in status and appearances, but here, in spaces filled with realness, with people who chose each other without obligation or pretense. Her friend spotted her and waved, grinning. "Took you long enough," they teased as she slid into the seat across from them. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and smiled. A real, unforced smile. "Yeah," she said, picking up the menu even though she already knew what she wanted. "But I'm here now." Her friend kept talking, filling the space with stories and updates. But Emma only half listened, not because she didn't care, but because, for the first time in years, she wasn't stuck in her own head, replaying old wounds like a broken record. She wasn't trapped in memories of holidays spent on the sidelines, of birthdays that felt more like obligations than celebrations. She was here, in the present, fully aware of the weight she had just left behind. She wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup in front of her, letting its heat seep into her fingers. It was such a small thing, but to her, it felt significant. A reminder that she was no longer that girl waiting at the edges of someone else's life, hoping to be acknowledged. No, she had stepped forward, had made a choice not just to walk away from them, but to walk toward something better. A life that wasn't defined by who had rejected her, but by who she chose to be. She took a sip of her coffee, the bitterness grounding her in the moment. It tasted like clarity, like certainty, like something entirely her own. There was no one left to please, no more battles to fight for a place that had never truly been hers. For so long, she had believed that walking away meant losing something, but now, she saw the truth. She hadn't lost anything. They had lost the chance to know her, to love her, to be part of the life she was going to build, and that was a loss they would have to live with, not her. Her friend nudged her, bringing her back to the present. "You good?" they asked, searching her face. Emma looked at them, at the ease in their expression, at the quiet understanding in their eyes. She nodded, a slow, knowing smile spreading across her lips. "Yeah," she said, and for the first time in years, she meant it. "I really am." As she sat there, surrounded by the quiet hum of life moving forward, Emma realized something: she didn't need a dramatic ending. No final confrontation, no desperate ET to prove anything. The real victory wasn't in making them regret their choices. It was in the peace she felt right now, in the way her chest no longer ached from carrying the weight of their rejection. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer had control over her. She had freed herself the moment she chose to stop looking back. Outside, the city pulsed with movement, people rushing past, heading somewhere, chasing something, but Emma wasn't rushing anymore. She had spent years running after love, after approval, after a place to belong. But now, for the first time, she wasn't chasing anything. She was simply here, and that was enough. She stood up, stretching slightly as she reached for her coat. The night wasn't over yet, and for the first time in a long time, she felt excited about what came next. Not in a grand, life-changing way, but in the quiet, steady way that real happiness creeps in slowly, gently, without needing permission. She didn't have a perfect plan for the future, but that didn't scare her anymore. Because whatever came next, it would be hers, built on her own terms, surrounded by people who truly saw her. As she stepped out into the crisp night air, she took one last look at her phone. The group chat with her friend buzzed, a message popping up. Where to next? Emma smiled, slipping her phone back into her pocket. Wherever she was going, she wasn't going alone. And that, more than anything, was the real ending she had always needed. Not one where she fought to be accepted, but one where she finally accepted herself.